Hello, everyone. This is Francis, Martin, and Curt for the Natural Law Institute. Today is Saturday, December 28th, 2024. This is our office hours Q&A section. We've been having so many questions pile up that we've started doing these every week. I think we're sort of making a dent, but they seem to be accumulating just as fast. If you do want to add questions, there's a link below in the description of the test. You can ask us questions if you'd like. And add it to the list. All right. Usually that works like Francis reads the question. Martin usually has an answer. And of course, it's usually the right answer. And then I go on and drone on for 20 minutes about all the details that you may or may not want to know about. Somebody sort of beat me up this week about it. I'm like, dude, if you want the short answer, there's plenty of people who do that. Our thing is we kill it, right? But anyway. All right, let's go.
All right, question one is actually for me. I had to wait something like 4 weeks for this question to get answered.
For you or from you?
From me. At what limits, along which dimensions, would fiat credit creation, i.e., borrowing time from the future, break the natural law of reciprocity?
This is a great question, but I'm sort of wondering, well, I would think you would know this or be able to have thoughts about it. So I'm worried that you're seeing something I don't. So could you explain?
I do have thoughts for it, and in fact,
Okay.
we between myself, Luke, and I think Martin as well, had a pretty long exchange over the NLI team channel on Signal. And I think where I think of it this way: borrowing time from the future, fiat credit creation, it's a technology like any other. It's a technology you can utilize for good, for investing in productive capacity, or it's a technology that can also use in detrimental ways, especially when you start charging interest on
Right.
that borrowed time.
Fundamentally, it's a share of stock in the economy, right?
I just say it carries a promise of value over time, and when you break that, then you're breaking reciprocity.
And I think where I try, I asked this question trying to find the limits because at some point, not a good thing taken to the extreme limits becomes detrimental. We all agree that
Mhm.
charging interest, i.e., usury, that that breaks the law of reciprocity. I think
Mhm.
where I and Luke start having some disagreements is when how long can you borrow without it starts to break the law? Is it just restricted to you? What if you're borrowing time from future generations? Because he's pointing that the future generations, they did not enter into this agreement. They did not enter into this contract voluntarily. And so borrowing time should be restricted to just you within your own current lifetime. But I tend to think of it, if you borrow this time from future generations for the productive capacity that you invest now in order for them to be born, then does it still break the law? So I'm trying to test where we place some limits on this technology.
Okay, I'm thinking this through. Okay. The reason I'm thinking is I'm trying to figure out which direction should I take this from, because I could take it from the reciprocity angle, I could take it from the state borrowing angle, or I could take it from um, the using consumers as the example angle. So it's probably easiest if I start with the consumer angle, play it up to the state level, and then talk about reciprocity. Would that be okay if I took that approach?
Mm. You remind me, there's also the dimension of who's actually the number of people, and also at what scale the polity that scales to.
Yeah, I think it's pretty much the same kind of concept. Um, Obviously, yeah, if you let's just start with the homeowners, okay? So in practical terms, right? You're borrowing for two things: consumption or capital, right? In other words, you're borrowing uh, to go on a trip to Disney World, or you're borrowing to put an addition on your house.
Mm-hmm.
The first is consumption, and the second is to produce capital. Another example would be I would borrow money to go gambling, which is the extreme version of consumption, or I would borrow money to put into investments. In other words, those the simple example was Disney World in the house. Tomorrow, the more advanced one would be I'm borrowing money to gamble, which is take a very high risk, or I'm borrowing money to take an investment, because the rate at which I can borrow is somehow more likely to be of value than the rate. In other words, what I can borrow is more likely to produce returns invested than the interest that I'm paying over time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first. In that case, there's sort of rules of thumb. Is that you really don't want to get above 20% for consumption debt, like buying TVs and furniture and crap.
20% of what?
Income,
Oh, sure. Yes.
right? And you don't want to get above, 50% when you're talking about capital use, right, for productive purposes. And so those are rules of thumb for consumers. I got this lesson when I was fucking 9 or something. I don't know. Well, I was lucky enough to live in a household where people understood money. So you get the talk about how to do this. And it used to be, this percentage of your income for your house, and this percentage for these things, this percentage for investments and whatever. Not that I exactly paid attention to it, but I did practiced it, but because entrepreneurs live in a different world. An entrepreneur basically will if you have a lot of money in a business becomes nearly 100% of what you're throwing. Aside from your house, even your house is at risk, because if you're going to run a business, then what you're really borrowing against is the equity in your house. So those are sort of rules of thumb. Now, if you scale that up so if you're working with that in your own place, there's not a reciprocity question at the consumer level, right? It's just a matter of you're exposing yourself to risk if you're severely injured. So like if you're a doctor or lawyer or white collar worker, as long as you don't take up extreme sports or something, or drive recklessly, or get involved in alcohol and drugs, your death risk is fairly low, right? It's at the margins. Whereas if you are, a guy who what is the job? Anything to do with making railroad cars come together, is incredibly profitable work. You got a fortune doing that job. Of course, you also lose digits, limbs, and life if you're not careful too. So that would say I would take less risk if I was in a job where I could be disabled, right, and my income would be would be easily harmed, versus where I was in a white collar job. Excuse me, where my income was not. A doctor can basically make a living until he drops dead, right? So that's the two. Now, the same thing applies to states. If you scale them up, you have a couple of extra things going on. You have you have the same problem, which is consumption debt versus investment debt. So if you go into investment debt and you're building power plants
Mm-hmm.
and transportations, well, at least road systems, road and rail, and airport systems, those things tend to produce returns if they're spread out well, right? Power, water, sewer, basic infrastructure, energy generation, etc. That tends to be an investment based. There are necessary expenses, which are, excuse me, then there are, I'm trying to do which order I should do this in. Then there are things where we're going into debt, which we shouldn't be going into debt for consumption, such as healthcare, retirement, and
Endowments.
right, yeah. So you go into all sorts of other things that are basically you're funding consumption, right? And so those don't have necessarily returns. The argument from the economists is, I hate when they play these games, but they say, well, yeah, I know, but if you keep people alive longer, they pay taxes longer. It doesn't work that way. Um, uh,
At some point, at some point in most people's lives, they become a net drain on the productive capacity of a polity.
the truth
Net
is, for,
consumers versus net contributors.
it used to be just, you could just say this about white people, the fact, but now you can say about white, Asian, and Indian people.
Mm-hmm.
Except that white, it used to be white males over 35 are the only net contributors to the economy. Everybody else is a drain. Certainly, the big complaint in America, which is the reason the federal government won't keep records, is because black people are an incredible drain.
Mm-hmm.
On the economy, in every consider sense. Women are an incredible drain in general. They consume, it used to be 70, now it's nearly 80% of services. And they, what?
Good Lord.
And they spend 70% of household income. So what you have is this great malincentive to appeal to women to spend money, which they do. So they maximize that, they maximize consumption, and they maximize government takings. So women are freaking expensive, not just for husbands, but for men indirectly throughout the economy. Um, so you have that issue going on. So what I'm really trying to get to is that you have spending, investment spending, which is basically infrastructure that provides returns. You have debt spending, which is for things like you shouldn't be, which is consumption. You're funding unfunded consumption. And then you have overhead costs, which is military and courts and things like that. And the big problem of debt arises originally because of military. Is that debt was very often a military related expense, more so than almost anything. Today, this is a problem because of the developing world is declining in population and no longer increasing that much in productivity. And so what's happening is the world equilibration has happened, and so that there aren't enough people being born to continue the intertemporal debt we've created, and the people that were immigrating are only 60 to 70% as productive. Right, so they're not able to. While they're telling us they can bring these people, and they're actually not able to replace. I mean, it's sort of like this argument we're having over Elon and Trump, etc. Immigrants. I mean, if you bring the 0.1% of the best scientists and engineers from around the world, that's an incredible advantage. But if you bring what percent of, I can't remember what percent of the South American world we've brought in, but I mean, that's not helpful. That's actually harmful. And so it depends on who you're immigrating for what purpose. So I gave out the three categories, right? The investment, consumption, and necessary overhead, right? And so the only thing that should be happen in necessary overhead should be the Federal Reserve. In our country,
Hold on. Necessary overhead should, instead of borrowing from future for that, shouldn't that just be paid from your ongoing income, i.e., tax receipts?
well, you can. It depends on what you want to have happen. So, right now we're spending. I can't remember what. It's probably off the top of your head, but we're spending what percent on military right now of GDP? What percent?
Let's see. It's at least 2%. I mean,
No, it's way
probably a
above.
lot more than that.
Right. So for 4 or 5 GDP is spent on the military. It's like let's see, 3.4 of GDP,
Yeah, see, it says here
4%, 50-year average. Yeah, that's about right. But
Congressional Budget Office projected defense spending of a share of gross domestic product will decline over the from 3% of GDP. Here it is. 2022 is 3.45 and then 3.5 and so on.
right.
So
but the problem is that we can't continue that spending, that low spending. And so we're already versed. Like I put up the thing yesterday, we finally got an ammo plant online, right? But we need 3 or 4 of them.
I think it's the question of where you spend, and not so much as to how much, right? So with let's just call it 3.5%. With 3.5%, we maintain something like 12 carrier battle groups. Those things, even in $1990, runs on $1 million a day.
Yes.
These days, it's got to be way more expensive.
I would say that, but the level, the returns on that are obscene.
Yes, when you want to kick down somebody's door.
It's not even that. It's just maintaining the world order. I mean, that's what allowed us to do it.
Well, I would argue that to maintain world order, we need a lot more smaller warships to really patrol the sea lanes.
Exactly, because we've cut down the Navy so that we don't have enough. We have this carrier-based thing for power projection, but we don't have the destroyers, et cetera, and smaller ships to do trade protection. So that's why you can have the Houthis get away with the stupid shit now, right? So, so we've just talked about the categories of debt, right? There's basically good debt and bad debt, right? There's good debt, bad debt, and an emergency debt. Let's call that. So during what I want to get to, we're spending. I'm just going to stay with 4% right now, right? If we're spending 4%, but when we went through the world wars, we would be spending 60% of GDP on the war.
According to, where is my? Well, according to the stats I was just looking at, it was more like what is it, 10% during the Cold War and so on. It didn't say.
Yeah, I think if you go back, it'll be 60% during the Second World War, and because that wasn't uncommon. I think I can't remember what the Soviets were spending, but it was a similar problem. And so you can do that, right? But you basically do what the Russians are doing now, is you militarize your whole economy, right? And you have to switch back afterwards from military economy to a regular economy. And so what you're doing is whenever your economy is doing A, it's not doing B. So anyway, so I've got those categories. Then we've got the idea that there's a certain amount of debt you should have. And right now, I think the consensus is you want to have less than 1 times, right? I mean, what is the consensus, the economic consensus on debt to GDP ratio? I should know this off the top of my head. I probably do. I just can't remember right at the moment. Suggested 90% is after 90% you slow growth. and that's only if you're an advanced economy. For most, you'd be in the 50 to 70%. It's
Mm-hmm.
not actually that different from households,
Yep.
right? It's not really that different from households. Now, the difference with households is that, at least in modernity, you uh, can't really transfer debt to your children. In other words, it used to be we did that way, but today you can't. If you die with a lot of debt, you sell off the house and your cars or whatever else you got, and everybody else gets
Mm-hmm.
fuck all, right? Um, so what happens in the condition of the state is it's passed on. So go ahead. You say
Yeah.
something?
I'm just agreeing.
Okay. So there's a couple of things to be looked at here. One is that there's always going to be rolling investment, right? In other words, it doesn't make sense to pay off your debt, because all you're doing is, if that debt, if you could borrow to increase your investments and preserve return on investments, you should do that. You're giving up opportunity, and usually what you're giving up is R&D on comparative advantage. So
Well, I
want
wanted to.
you want investment debt, just like in your own home. If you can borrow money to invest in things, it's in your interest to borrow money to invest in things if the risk profile is higher than not. The usual answer is people who pay off their home, then start collecting rental properties, right, to rent off. Those are really good investments.
Mm-hmm.
So if your choice is to save, to consume versus save versus invest, the optimum answer, of course, is to invest. How you invest that, of course, is dependent on your risk profile. So when you're talking about a country, it's no value to pay off your debt. There's just no value in it, because if you have the capacity to have debt, all you're doing is saying, I have nothing to invest in. Well, that's not the case. I can't think of any country that has nothing to invest in.
Well,
So
I think the minor difference I would say is over time you're going to need to pay off the debt, but just that you have this debt servicing capacity and you want to apply it to investment, so you always want to carry
right,
some kind of debt to fund the investment. It's just
that's
that
what I meant. Rolling debt.
it's going to be rolling. You would
Yeah,
never shrink it down to zero because that means you have nothing else to invest
right. So you want to have rolling. You want to have rolling debt. You probably should, if you're in a developing economy, it's 50%. If you're, a sort of a, a small but developed economy, like most of the average states in the EU, want to keep it at 60. If you're lucky in America, you can keep it above 60 and as high as 90. Now the problem is, what's ours right now?
in.
It's
123. I
Yeah,
just looked it up.
exactly. Now,
Not as bad as Japan's, which is like 230 or something.
yeah, but I mean, you know, you're not nobody thinks the Japanese yen is going to drop to zero tomorrow, right?
Mm-hmm.
And nobody thinks the American dollar is going to drop to zero tomorrow either. Um, so this is accumulation of mistakes made during that, and democracies are hella good at making these mistakes during the past 50 years. So, all right. So we've answered that. So the next, if you want to have rolling debt, then the question is whether it's reciprocal or not. As I think that was the original question.
That's the original questions because here's the thing, right? If you think about it from both at a smaller scale, let's say family. Well,
Yeah,
technically, personal is a small scale, but let's just use family, right? From family to nation, in
yeah,
terms of horizon, from just your lifetime till century perpetuity.
yeah,
In the family sense, let's say that I take on a debt to put a extension on my house, and I want this house to become my ancestral home or something.
yep, yep.
So let's say that this debt is over the next 100 years. I'm exaggerating. Let's say the debt's over the next 100 years, which means my children, their children, are going to inherit this debt.
Absolutely.
I think Luke's argument here is it's irreciprocal because future generation did not agree to it. And
What do you mean they didn't agree what to get
they
in
did
here?
not agree to get into this debt. I made the agreement to enter into this debt relationship,
Hey, man,
even though it's for the
I lost the
benefit.
argument, brother. I lost it. What you said is I have a house. I have added debt onto this house,
Hmm.
right? Right. And what you're saying is the kids would object to you having added the debt to the
Well,
house?
no, my point is I did this for my future generations, even though they did not voluntarily enter into this agreement, and therefore I do not think this breaks the voluntary aspect
There's no
of.
agreement because it's not reciprocal. There's no reciprocity involved. They're your kids. You can give it to them. It's a donation, but you can't. It's not a liability. If it's not. I mean, it's a gift. It's not a. It's that there's no reciprocity at all. I realize. I think and if you come from a culture, I think, and you do come from a culture where there's some certain obligations between
Mhm.
generations, then that might be the case. But in the nuclear family, the absolute nuclear family in particular, there is no obligation. There's no obligation for any inheritance, and so the kids have no right to anything. It's whether you want to give it to them or not. And so, at least in Western culture, um, that there's no reciprocity involved. There's only whether you want to give it to them. So that's an act of love and care, but it's not an act of reciprocity. There's no reciprocity involved.
Um,
Interesting.
the point is, if they don't have a right to anything from you, then you don't have a right to impose that on them.
I see what you mean. So it's not in this case. There's no reciprocal exchange
Yep.
because when I pass it on, right? It's I pass on both the equity as well as the debt to them, and they have to they can agree to it, or they can say, well, I'm not going to enter this. I'm just going to sell the house.
Well, at least in most of the developed world, you have to pay off your debt when you die.
Hmm.
So you could give them the remaining equity in the house, which they could then refinance and keep the house. Otherwise, they would just get the balance of the equity
Okay.
because debt is non-transferable. It's non-transferable under ordinary circumstances. I want to check my voice. Is my volume level okay?
It comes okay from my end.
Because I keep getting hit on this. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, it's all the way. No, it isn't. There we go. How's that? That's better. All right. So you don't have that intergenerate. There's no debt there. There's no relationship there.
Hmm.
Likewise, if you thought about the government as a corporation, because that's what it is, and we're all shareholders in it. If I buy into this company, which is what I do when I'm bored and I'm a citizen, if I buy into this company and I pay my taxes, right, which is basically you're contributing
Hmm.
assets to it, and then I die and the next generation comes along and then repeats the process. It's just a rolling debt of the corporation. There's no irreciprocity there. So when it's investment debt or when it's in, say, necessary debt like wars, um, if you get into the position of consumption debt, which is where most of
Hmm.
the West is in right now, then it is an irreciprocity because you're consuming something, you're consuming an asset of the corporation, you're not contributing to it. Right. You're not making a debt to produce an investment that will have higher returns. You're making a debt that puts an imposition of costs on returns.
Yes.
So it's so. I mean, and in the essence, that's the how simple the answer is is the is that the crime, the great crime, was the progressive false promise of endless growth, the use of fiat money and fiat credit to create extraordinary debt, at the same time as they had ended the demand for savings necessary for retirement. So not only did the boomer generation and the people that slightly came, and the generation that came before them, not only did they spend more debt, but they spent all the money that would have otherwise been saved that would reduce the transfer to other generations. So the next generation.
When you went there, I in mental I thought so. It's actually pretty simple. The boomers screwed everything up again.
Right, except I keep saying this. I'm not sure it's not the boomers, the people who were in charge in the post-war period.
The boomers' parents, the greatest
It's
generation.
the boomers' parents. The problem is that we allowed the boomers' parents. I would say the argument was, yeah, it would be nice if the Germans won World War I. It would be nice if McCarthy had been successful instead of what happened, because instead they used all this oppression nonsense, civil rights nonsense, to be able to expand debt, right? And in doing so, not in doing so, really deprive later generations of it. Now, the problem you can't see from today, and certainly the Gen Z and Alpha aren't going to give a shit about. They're going to justify it away, just like every generation justifies it away. Is people believed the false promise of endless growth? They really did. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until I mean, how long ago did this whole population crash thing come about? It wasn't that long ago.
It was less than a decade.
Yeah, it's
Mouse Utopia and all that just became popular terms in the last few years, and the whole population crash thing. I mean, maybe a few in the fringe we're talking about a decade ago, but it's really since the pandemic that it starts to become coming to popular parts.
Yeah, let me ask this: when did the study,
the Mouse Utopia study,
come out where I think it was the UN, I think told countries they needed immigration because reproduction was dropping below replacement levels, and the social programs, what do you call them? The benefits programs so couldn't be paid for. I can't remember when that was. If I can, it'll come out here. March 2000. Yes.
That was earlier than I thought.
Yeah. So the way I remember it is the big shift in my recollection, right? I mean, this is my recollection. I would have to go make sure I'm not wrong. The big shift was all the hype we had to do during the World Wars, especially the Second World War and the Cold War, and all this propaganda shit, the shit that Martin is really pissed about, right? All this
wars themselves too.
What?
I'm pissed about the wars themselves too.
Well, we're all pissed about that. That was wrong. But I mean, the point of all this bullshit, right? That ended in around 1992. I remember it in 92 so clearly because I think I've said this before. I remember Zachariah coming out and talking about it. I'm like, fuck, they're not going to shift. The government isn't going to shift out of this glorious world of bureaucratic power they've built and this whole treating the world as their customer instead of the nation, right? They're not going to shift. And they didn't. And so when that didn't happen, you could start to see at least those of us. I mean, I was pretty young at the time, but I mean, how old was I? In 92, was I 30?
30 something.
30. 132. And I remember thinking they're not going to shift. And they didn't. And that, um, uh, and that they were going to continue on with the false belief that this growth would continue forever, right? And what had happened is we'd gotten the technology boom by then, right? It was really taking off by then. And so we were seeing all this optimism roll down.
Yeah.
But what was happening was you were still seeing the decline of the ordinary economy while the tech economy was going up. And you see that
easy to see that shining spot and have it mask everything else that's going on, especially mask the consumption in the accumulated capital of the polity.
And so, in the 80s, we were still pretty good. We loved each other and whatever. 90 came around, we had that huge consumption boom under Clinton, and, China had shifted over. Mm-hmm. So we thought we'd won all this crap. And, prices on consumer goods came down because China's manufacturing came online. And all the while, nerds like me are saying, every time we transfer a business somewhere, it transfers the knowledge necessary to operate the technology that builds that business somewhere else, and we get dumber. I said, you're not accounting for knowledge, right? And so, how do I want to finish this up? That's the problem. Is this? There's such a lag because bureaucratic investment in the Cold War, the post-war Cold War bullshit, and we had this windfall afterwards where we got Clinton and then Obama, and we had this bullshit propaganda of hyperconsumption, all this progressive Marxist, and then we had, this by the time we get to, was it 2009, we get Obama coming in with his anti-colonialist, which is anti-white nonsense, and that's when the woke took hold. So in the sense that Martin's railing against this all the time, he's right. The problem is you can't. There's two things going on. The world order is really valuable, but it's valuable for keeping costs down. On the flip side, there's this fucking cancer. It's like communism was bad, but we almost killed communism. Now, how can we kill the propaganda shit that rode as the false promise of all this bullshit on top of the anti-communist bullshit? It's like, go ahead, Martin.
Communism was killed because Trotskyists realized so-called capitalism gets them what they want much easier.
God, I wish I could hear you better, Martin. I can't hear you.
So, communism was destroyed because Trotskyists realized the so-called capitalism gets them what they want much easier.
Yes. Which is why they switched to cultural Marxism. This
is why I call post-war order from both sides, from America and Soviets, was a war against the old aristocratic order.
That's really smart, actually, that pitch. Because it was, right? Well, a war against responsibility altogether.
Yeah.
All right. So,
all based on egalitarianism, which is ultimately entirely incompatible with noblesse oblige.
Yes. Martin, can you fucking put that in Twitter for me so that we capture the Martin quote there?
I'll have to write something bigger eventually.
Well, just put it in there so it sticks. I don't want to have it get lost. And the thing is, if it's in there, I'll see it 3 times today, and so it'll stick in my head. I want to make sure it sticks in my head. I mean, I'll go do it if you want me to.
I'll write.
So, because that's actually, and the reason I'm asking you is because the part I'm working on right now is the collapse of aristocratic values in chapter 1 or the book 1. I'm dealing with that right now, and I want to make use of that.
It was not collapse, it was destruction.
Yeah. Okay. Well, great. Let's talk about that some more, because we need to we should address it. I'm what I'm really running up against is I'm like, okay, we've spent half an hour on this question, and the guy's beat me up for the last time, and I'm like, do you want to digress into that? I'm like, I would love to, Martin. We should afterwards. After the Q and A, let's have a discussion about this because it's valuable for everybody. It's certainly valuable for me to put in the book. I'm sure you have insights in it, um, uh, uh, and especially because you're making a clear connection uh, between the metaphysics of the aristocratic order, like the things we presume, and the war against it. Whereas what we have been generally doing is falling into the trap of keep talking about economics, or in other words, the visible things rather than the invisible.
Yeah, it creates the false dichotomy of capitalism versus communism.
Correct. All right, so
I think as far as this question goes, I think we've done it justice.
Okay.
All right, let's move to question 2. From Kiran, please deliberate on the Zong massacre. In 1781, a ship carrying a cargo of slaves began to run out of water after making navigational errors. The cargo slaves had been insured. However, the insurance would not apply if the slaves died after reaching land or if they died of thirst, i.e., natural death. It was decided to throw some of the slaves overboard so the insurance will cover them under general average, where the captain jettisoned part of his cargo and saved the rest. After making landfall, insurance refused to cover the losses, and the shipping company sued them. In the first trial, the jury found the shipping company as it was established protocol that slaves were considered cargo. The verdict was appealed on the basis of whether it was absolutely necessary to throw the slaves overboard and whether the insurers were responsible for losses resulting from errors committed by the crew. The case was considered as a commercial affair. However, abolitionists unsuccessfully tried to have the sailors prosecuted for murder. The event was commonly cited in subsequent abolitionist literature, and in 1794, the renewal of the Slave Trade Act limited the scope of insurance policies on slaves. Some questions. Is it permissible to treat the affair on solely commercial grounds under natural law? Do modern attitudes towards slavery have any bearing on the lawfulness of this case?
Slaves weren't in group. The law didn't apply to them other than as property. I'm unsure about this answer, but this seems to me to be stretching what the insurance would cover. The slaves didn't fall overboard by accident. They were thrown overboard. So they would die specifically because the insurance wouldn't cover that. The costs ought to go to whoever made those navigational errors because he's clearly at fault here.
So I'm trying to figure out. So Martin's right here, of course. He answers the question correctly. I'm trying to think if there's anything I can contribute other than you can't project knowledge back in of the present back into the past. You can't project morals of the present back into the past if they were rational in the past. You can't attribute economic choices from the present into the past if they were rational in the past. So as Martin said, it's more that they threw the guys overboard, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, from our standpoint, well, go ahead.
I would say the same for any property.
Yes.
The fact that we're humans doesn't affect this at all.
Right. So this is a great example of when you say natural law. Martin says there's in-group and out-group. Natural law applies when you want to cooperate.
The natural law of cooperation applies.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't. If you don't want to cooperate, that's something else. I mean, he's like, well, when you're at war with people, there's the only value of natural law is to think about how would we reconcile afterwards. It has nothing to do with what you actually do, other than is this going to prevent reconciliation afterwards? If you're saying, well, I want to raise the place to the ground. And salt the earth and kill every soul that's ever been here. I mean, there's no natural. You're certainly not concerned about uh, reconciliation and cooperation afterwards. There's no natural. There's no natural law question involved there. It's just one of utility, which is interesting. So I guess what I found interesting is the intelligence of this question, yet the fact that what are we doing wrong when we talk about natural law?
I think the
Is it,
assumption is natural law applies to all people in all interactions, whereas specifically, that's why I said natural law of reciprocity only applies to in-group.
So
And it's
that's why you have to distinguish between it as a law of nature
yeah,
and as rule of law, which is a choice we make where to apply it,
yeah.
where we want to cooperate.
Well, people. That's an interesting question. There's three levels. Then there's how people will behave in terms of retaliating. That's right. That's number one. Right. There's a number two is what's the practical reality of it, right? And number three is if you're trying to organize a large body of people to cooperate, this is what you should do as law. So I guess it's the three states, the three categories of how we talk about it, which Martin has made me think about lately, which is that everything I think of, I do on a spectrum, and I'm still finding it very common that people ask questions as if we're still just practicing uh, theological or Socratic logic, and we're not. We're doing supply versus demand instead of syllogisms. And so if you're it's really easy for people to who don't understand what we're doing to get caught up in what I think are word games or set games instead of operational games. And so what we one of the I mean one of the I mean the big deal underneath what we're doing epistemologically is we're converting from this what we consider backward thinking, which is the philosophy throughout history, whether it be up through rational philosophy or even formal logic, is it's based on a set of errors, much like with the problem of economics. In economics, the real problem is everything's fucking fungible all the time, so categories are inconsistent. Well, because that's what happens over time. Well, it's the same thing with everything else we talk about. We use these terms, but the term refers to usually a dimension. That dimension consists of a spectrum. That spectrum is satisfied by some variation or caused by some variation in supply and demand. And so we get this question, which is fundamentally a good question, in the sense that the individual is asking what's right to do, I think, in this question, or he's asking or he's testing the natural law of cooperation. I'm like, well, I mean, if you're a Christian or if you're actually an Abrahamist or you have any theological foundation other than Japanese, you probably think in some terms of universals. Well, we don't think in terms of universals. We said there are universal behaviors, but that's all. We say they respond to stimuli, um, and so I'm a little bit struck in how we're going to fix that problem of failing to communicate what we're actually doing.
I
In
don't
the
think there's
so
a
in the sense of law of nature, all this says is where we observe groups that are cooperating, this is the pattern
Correct.
that you can see, but that doesn't mean everyone is cooperating
No.
or that everyone needs to.
All right.
well. So I have a follow-up question then. So since natural law of reciprocity does not apply to outgroups, then what natural law do outgroups operate under?
Say that again.
So the natural law of reciprocity does not only applies to in-group right? We don't use that to apply to when looking at in-group relationships. But
Um,
even without groups, it's human beings still behave according to certain natural law. Then what law do they behave under?
Well, they behave according to the same law. The difference is what are you trying to achieve reciprocity or not? In other words, are you trying to I mean, people are going to behave in response to the via negativa, right? That's what they're going to behave like. I mean, humans don't vary in that behavior. That's the problem is when you take a descriptive law, like is what we do, and you cast it as a prescriptive law. And it's not a prescriptive law.
I see what you're saying.
Everything we do is descriptive. When we get into saying, organize your government this way, we create a prescriptive menu of choices to facilitate the description of how the people behave. But I think that, that's great. Thank you for bringing this up. I think it's a great example of the problem I underestimate, which is the tendency of people to look at our work like we're giving a theological or philosophical rather than a scientific statement, right? We're just saying this is what people will do, therefore choose accordingly.
Yes.
If you want people to cooperate, here's the criteria under which they tend to cooperate, right? But it's descriptive, it's not prescriptive. We can give advice on the descriptive, right? Because of descriptive, but there's no. Go ahead.
That's why we need to make a clear delineation between the science, which is what you write in the books, versus the reform policies. The science is the descriptive part. It's like writing down formulas, how Newton's law of motion works, and so on. And then the prescriptive part is you should not jump off buildings because you will, the law of gravity will ensure that you smash into meat bits, and that's what we have in the Declaration and the Constitution.
Correct. Actually, maybe we ought to organize the work that way between descriptive and prescriptive. Right. I mean, in other words, we ought to make a big deal about it.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Isn't one volume supposed to be Constitution, which is the prescriptive part?
Yes.
Well, there you go.
I thought this was pretty obvious, and
You thought what?
I thought that the fact that the science and the law from your work is descriptive versus prescriptive. I thought that's pretty obvious.
Yeah, I think it's obvious to us, but I'm thinking about all these people who come to this from the theological or philosophical or even normative background, is they think in prescriptive terms, like that, the Ten Commandments or the whatever, and it's like, no, we can do that, but we actually do the opposite, which is we say just what people do. All right. So let's see, 40 to 8 was a 20-minute one. All right.
All right. Question 3. How do you see the evolution of artistic creation in an age where machines like CNC, sculpting marble are seamlessly integrated into the process? Does the precision of technology dilute the human touch that defines art, or does it merely extend the artist's tools? Similarly, how do you evaluate the authorship and authenticity of works attributed to figures like Damien Hirst or Jeff Koons, whose creations are often the result of vast teams rather than their direct involvement? At what point does the detachment of the creator from the physical act of creation alter the artistic value or legitimacy of the work? Thanks.
This is an ancient question, the theory of art. A couple of facts are helpful. One is that most great artists worked in workshops. So we don't know, for example, of all the great medieval artists, who are responsible for these paintings and stuff like that. We don't know how much actual work they did on any of those paintings. We don't know how much work they actually did on each of those sculptures, because most of them were done in shops, right? They were done in shops. So the person might have the person who creates the design, the David sculpture,
Michelangelo.
right? So when the person who did the design of it often did mock-ups, right? You did sketches, drawings. Usually, a lot of painters painted painted out first attempts and treated them as sketches until they felt they had it right. So it's more of an engineering process. The same thing with sculpture. I mean, you don't go and build you might look at a piece of marble and say, I want to build a sculpture there, but you probably built it in clay or wax beforehand, and then only modify it as the stone revealed itself with its flaws, etc. So art has generally been, any art of what we call monumental art or high art, is generally been the work of teams of people, even if inspired and designed by the mind of one person. Now, you might expect that from monumental art. Would you expect that from Vermeer? I don't know if you know Vermeer. Vermeer is the guy where there's usually a window on the upper left, and there's light coming down on the person here, right? And there's a different background, but it's usually the same thing. Well, those were largely painted by Vermeer, right, by himself. But the point that you want to notice there is he was using, oh God, I can't remember the name of the thing. You basically look through a lens that's at an angle or a prism, and you see both what you're drawing and painting and the thing you're looking at. So what is the name of that?
The what?
There's a name. I can't remember the name of the tool. Oh,
For doing.
still buy it. You can still buy them. You can buy antique ones. I don't know if they make ones modern anymore. What is the name? What is the name of the tool artists like Vermeer used to see both the subject and what he was drawing and painting?
Oh, like some kind of light contraption.
It's a gizmo that you can prism through things.
Okay.
Here it is. Camera obscura. No, that's not it. That's not it. Anyway, it's a little device. I'll find it at some point and post it. But it's a little contraption, and so you're basically looking down like this, but you can see like you can see. It looks like you're tracing over what you're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like a lens thing. So I've actually used one. Today we tend to use projectors, but same and all sorts of things. But in any event, when I was, you could buy a projector for about $120 when I was in art school. So I had this little black projector. You draw your stuff out, you put the paper in, you project it on the wall, you move your canvas into position, right? Get them all right. There was some distortion because there's always lens distortion, right? So you have to play this game with lines a little bit and straighten them out. But you get that up there, you draw it out, and then you've scaled up the baseline for your painting. Then you put in your background colors, your underpainting, and you just build up layers on top of that. Anyway, so what is the real question here? The real question underneath it is the difference between a poster and a painting, right? So when you have a poster, you found something you like and you put it on the wall, right? And it's something that you like. Posters were really big in the 80s. I don't remember why. I just know that we made a lot of money selling frame posters. Then then we got into where today where you have printers that can print on canvas or print out canvas-like stuff, and people tend to do a lot of that stuff too. So when you have that, what how is that different from a guy who somebody, a woman, a man who does a painting by hand, right? That is basically a replication or one that is replication of a theme or that is not a replication of a theme. It's in a particular style, or it's in a style invented, style that's a fashion in the moment, or a style that's invented by the artist in the moment. That's a spectrum I just illustrated, right, from one to the other. And so if you go to art school and you're taught art theory like I was, they'll teach you the concept of oneness, right? Right. The Mona Lisa is unique, right? It's a oneness thing, right? It's also an example of a technological innovation, and it's also representative of a movement in time. And so and it's also become what is called canon. It's an example used in the field to judge other paintings by. So think of it as a measurement, right? It's a measurement of things within that particular domain of art, that's that range. So canonical arts are highly valuable.
Hmm.
Underneath that, there are there are arts from canonical movements, right? And then there are arts from derivations and expressions of canonical movements, and then there's commodity art that's an imitation of it. And then there's student art that's what I mean, and then there's homemade. So there's a way of breaking this problem down. So which thing can you afford to pay for so that you can feel the value of status from having paid for it? So if I put up on an art or a piece of art one comma, well, I might be inspired by it, right? But if I buy a work by, I mean, if somebody said Jeff Koons here, if I buy a work from one of who's the guy that does the New York guy that does the little stick figures, his name is escaping me. Um, so if you buy one of those, you're buying into an aesthetic of a time and a place and a canon, and you're doing it not only because it decorates your space, but it gets you ownership, membership in a club, so to speak, right? What do you call it? An identity. It gives you membership and identity. It's like wearing clothes that are from a specific designer, or I mean, I mean, if you're a goth chick, right? I mean, you're buying into an identity. Well, when you buy a painting from some of these artists or a sculpture of one of these artists, you're buying into an identity. If you buy it into a rare identity, you're buying in status in that within that identity. And so that's what's so when how do you see it happen? Well, that's what's going on, and that's all it's happening. When you're saying I take a CNC machine and it's sculpting marble, most of the time the CNC machine does the grunt work. It does not do the fine work. Um, that said, we could get CNC machines to eventually do the fine work, right? So what are you actually buying? This thing is, if this is a big monumental piece, you're still something that's very fucking expensive. It took a lot of work for people to do, right? And it was done by a machine, but it was actually designed by a person. So is that like the painting the guy made by hand or the sculpture the guy made by hand? Or is that like the commodity painting or the poster? I would say that, it's not quite as bad as a poster, but it might be like the commodity painting or the imitation painting. So unless it turns out that the sculpture you've bought, it turns out to be so innovative. It was very fucking hard to innovate in sculpture. It's almost impossible. So what are you going to do that's that innovative or that symbolic? So if you actually were able to pull something that off, great, but it's almost impossible to do it.
The way I kind of see it, based on, I mean, provided I'm not an artist at all. In fact, I kind of pride myself in functionality over form. But the way
Yes.
I kind of see it is when you're buying a piece of work, you're buying how much time from the artist. A mass-produced poster that's printed by the millions, you're maybe buying a tiny fraction of their time, versus the original art that defined the oneness. Guess what? You're buying a lot of their time. Despite this guy, he's the let's say Van Gogh's painting, right? He's
Mhm.
already dead, been dead for a long time. When you buy a piece of his painting, his time that he invests in that painting has appreciated over the last
Right.
100 something or so years. Likewise for Michelangelo or whatnot.
Yes. Well, you're right. Of course, I actually should have covered that. I'm sorry I didn't. Um, so, uh, so there's the belief that you are. It comes down to something like this. I have touched Van Gogh. Right? I have a direct relationship to Van Gogh, and I have a direct relationship, a meaningful relationship with Van Gogh, because I have all the time he put into this. Right. So this is a piece of his existence that's captured in semi-permanent form. So you have that. You have. It's like I said. There's only three dimensions: the craftsman, the craft, the meaning, and the design, the aesthetics, right? And then the rest of it's basically scarcity, right? It's scarcity, and then the scarcity of talent is basically times up. So you're talking about a lot of time that's highly scarce in high quality, that's highly representative of a period that by the in and is a canonical piece of the period. You can't go. There's nowhere to go above there. Right, there's nowhere to go above there. So time is actually really good. That was really good to bring
And
in.
with digitization, I mean, it used to be you have to buy a poster, which is still atoms. But with the internet, with digitization, it has created even lower run of cheap, like readily
Yes,
replicable pieces of time. Like imagine this way, right? A JPEG of Van Gogh's work, how cheaply could that be produced?
right.
It doesn't give you, and it certainly doesn't give you the same panache and say, oh, I have this JPEG of Van Gogh's work versus I have his original work, or even I have a poster of his work.
Yeah. So this is a great. I have a good example of that. So back in the 70s and 80s, we had Frank Frazetta and Boris Vallejo and a couple of
Mm-hmm.
others
Yeah,
making fantasy paintings.
yeah,
Right.
they're awesome.
One of my friends, who's fucking smoking hot, was a model for Vallejo. I can't remember which
Oh
one.
shit! I probably have her then in
It,
one of my
he didn't have
books.
to. He didn't have to imagine anything. She was at. There was no creativity needed to drape some silk or whatever on this girl.
Mm-hmm.
Right, just smoking hot. Not bright, from a very wealthy West Hartford family, but smoking hot, and of the artistic personality. So she was in. Anyway, I could go. I have all sorts of stories about this. So the problem is, if you were to line up all those guys, the people that did, I can't remember the other guy his name is escaping me. There's not a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the days of Metal Hurlant, we think of heavy metal over here, where we have things like uh, Alien is the product of Mobius as much as it is of what's his name, Giger.
Mm.
There just weren't a lot of those guys around. I mean, there were just a couple.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So what was your reference material? The reference material available to you was something you had to physically go out and buy. But between the advent of computerized art, right, that we're doing art on the computer, the advent of computers making it possible to do this and to do this very quickly and in large numbers. I mean, the number of artists producing that stuff, I mean, it's like there's just zillions of them now. I mean, what's the website that they all go to? Forgot the name of it. So there's zillions of them. So the talent in art has gone crazy, but it's also destroyed the uniqueness of it. So there's a lot more, but how good is it? I don't know. trying to think of the guy. There's the guy who did all the spaceships, round, vertical line. God damn it! I'm sorry. I just have I have a little bit of cold, so it's my memory's usually not that is for the things that are not that are that far back is not that good. But I can't.
I think I know who you're talking about. I've seen the paintings. I
Yes.
just don't know. I mean, I just don't know the name of the artist. Yeah, so I would even go out on a limb and say as digitization becomes even
Whelan,
more perversive.
Michael Whelan. That's what I was thinking
Hmm?
of.
Who?
Michael Whelan.
Michael Whelan.
Yeah.
How do you spell the last name?
Wait, I might be got this wrong. No, it's the wrong one. Might be Chris Foss. I have to worry. Michael Whelan or Chris Foss. Try those two. I'm insulting these guys by not remembering separating them. I feel it's Chris Foss that I was thinking of. Michael Whelan does the other guy who does the fantasy stuff.
Can you put his last name or just put his name in the chat?
Whelan, WHELAN.
Sorry, what? W what?
WHELAN. And you'll come up with the right stuff.
Oh, I
He's
see.
sort of, and then Chris Foss is the one that I think most of us would think of as science fiction.
How do you spell false?
FOSS.
Ah, yes.
And you know, I'm not. Can I say something awful?
Do it.
A lot of these guys who do these half naked, these guys are such pervs.
Oh yeah, of course. You know, I didn't know
I
this.
can't. You know,
So
it's funny. I can throw around a lot of names, and I'm like, shit, I haven't thought about those
well,
guys in forever. Right?
so I kind of went into this. I don't know. Went into this dive. Back in the '90s, I'm aware of the work of Boris Vallejo, and then eventually Julie Bell, I guess his wife, who started out as one of his models.
Yes.
But then in Japan, there's also a guy by the name of Sorayama Hajime.
Yes.
And if you look at Hajime's paintings, which is airbrush and everything, this is the guy who painted gynoids and all the shiny female robot stuff, right?
Yeah, I know you're
But
talking about.
if you look at his stuff, I mean, this is over the top, like
Yeah.
only some perverted Japanese mind.
It's just porn you can get away with.
Yes, you can get away with. I mean, it's basically pornography.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you can get away with it as hard in Japan. Like you won't be able to get away with it here.
You know, this is a really great sidebar. I mean, for the audience, if you don't like the sidebars, fucking scroll ahead or something. But you know, you can't step back into the 70s. It's very hard to step back into the culture today in the 70s because there wasn't all this crap between men and women at all,
Mm-hmm.
right? You know, and there wasn't this kind of whoring around either, like that's going around today, right? Things were still you could have a tryst, but it was usually meaningful, like you were friends or something, right? I mean,
A tryst.
a tryst, an experimental sexual encounter between people who are somewhat knowledgeable of one
Okay.
another. So
This stuff so much of the '70s, the '80s romance movie were based on.
well, I mean, it's hard to go back there and recognize what it was like because the culture was much higher trust, right? It was much higher trust at the time, and so you could do all sorts of things. Like you could have a little hidden thing and flirt around and stuff like that, and it wouldn't go anywhere. Right? I mean, it wouldn't turn out to spread around and whatever. I mean, I had this one Jewish chick. She was. I'm not. Anyway, very.
Before this sidebar goes too deep.
Fuck. Very. Anyway, she was very aggressive in pursuit. Let's just say that. And then for the problem is, my type, right? 105 pounds, 5'2", big eyes, skinny, really bubbly. It's hard to say no, man.
Oh, she's a bit short.
But then you got to
5'2".
understand that I'm not the only guy she would go after, right? I mean, she would go after one of the profs next, and then one of the grad students. You know what I mean? It was just one of those things. But it wasn't like the shit that happens today, where it's almost like commercial, like the dating scene, like the Bumble shit and whatever. I mean, when people they're not actually getting to know each other or anything. They're not trying to make. I mean, I don't know. It's almost impersonal. Anyway, there were good things about each decade. Not so much this one.
Well, we're in the fourth turning.
Yep. So do we answer that one, right? We did, okay.
Yeah, I think so. All right, question 4 from Kiran. The NLI has proposed that in order to limit dysgenic reproduction, those who cannot support themselves, i.e. those on welfare, should be limited to one child. This allows them to exercise the biological urge to reproduce and aligns their long-term incentives, while limiting their fertility to below replacement. How would this be achieved in practice? Mothers on welfare being given the choice to have their tubes tied after birth or forfeit all future welfare payments. How would this policy deal with mothers who give birth at home or who decide to rely on alms or starve in the street? What are the ethical considerations here, calling e.g. Oliver Twist and workhouses in the Victorian era? And how would such a policy be informed by the successes and failures of past policies that were similarly intended?
I think most of those who currently can't support themselves don't really have an urge to have children, but have them as a consequence of having unprotected sex, in which case they probably shouldn't even have one child, and conditioning welfare on having tubes tied is a reasonable expectation. But with the rare case where there's an actual demand for children, the limit of one keeps it below replacement, which is not an issue provided we keep productive people above replacement. Now, if the individual doesn't demand welfare, it's not the state's business. But if he's begging in the streets, it may very well be the local community's business, since they may have zero tolerance for that, in which case, how they deal with it is up to them.
Yeah, the simple version is that if you have not the self-regulation to engage in protected sex, such that you're bearing an accidental offspring, and you are not self-sufficient enough to care for it, the community must defend itself against your poor judgment. And as such, you can't really give them the choice of whether they would have their tubes tied or not as a result of this pregnancy. You pretty much have to do it, right? You have to tie their tubes. Now the truth is that that's mostly reversible. So the problem with this is that so the question is, you have to defend the polity against the impulsivity of these people. I mean, I can't tell you how many videos I've seen where it's like, I have 8 children from 8 baby daddies. I mean, what the fuck? And I get $3,000 a month in support.
Section 8 housing.
And so the problem is, one is one thing, but we just have to have it sterilized. And you probably should save for both male and female, even though that's probably the right answer, is to do both. I don't think you can get around it, because it's just really expensive. I mean, that whole demographic is expensive in the first place, right? There's a net cost on everybody else. But having lots of children, that's even worse, because you're multiplying the problem. All right, what's next?
All right, from Kiran again. Michael Levin talks about freedom of embodiment. that once we crack the morphogenic code, we will be able to modify our body embodiments in various ways, from physical form to lifespan to IQ. He frames this as a moral imperative to improve the lived experiences of all. Obviously, the universalism is untenable unless every group decides that freedom of embodiment is a mutually defended right. But otherwise, how would this concept be analyzed under natural law? Would it require empirically observe the stability and competitiveness of a group guaranteeing this right, seeing as no data yet exists since this is a hypothetical future scenario?
I regard all things like this as dystopian and anti-human, and I don't see why anyone should have a right to bring about horrors beyond our comprehension.
Pretty much. I'll go. I'll say this: if we can have the modification that chicks can have elf ears, I'm all in.
What, not men?
I don't care. I'm looking for it. I mean, humans look better with elf ears. What can I say?
Many people would agree with that, but it's a slippery slope to cat girls, and soon you're creating centaurs.
Yes, I said it just to add the humor of, well, some of it's probably okay. I think the problem is that if you were to do that, you would have to be sterilized, because while you can be in control of the expression within you, what you're doing is subjecting the genome to consequences of your expression and recombination. I agree with Martin. I think this is, if you're fixing something that's wrong. Trying to think of something. I had just 10 really absurd things go through my head. Like if we want all our men to be 6 feet tall and our women to be 5'10" or 5'9", right? Great. Those are aesthetic changes, right? If you're talking about, I mean, Martin, what would you? I mean, if some gene pool, if we find out that it takes this 65 different SNPs to limit the decline of IQ below 105, would you be okay with that?
How would I be sure it wouldn't do anything?
Yeah, I know, that's the problem, right? It sounds really great until you say, yeah, we don't have, the outcome of that is something we don't know.
Well, so then the way to solve that problem is by having physically isolated groups.
Correct.
Right? On different planets, that you can run these experiments and make sure you have a control.
Yeah. So, my attitude toward this is, as long as it includes elf ears as a positive change, and everything else is doing the. I rarely can get an expression out of Martin. I'm getting one. I'm getting one on this one. I think that there's certainly defects that are worth eliminating if we can be sure that's what they are, defects, right? Some things. I mean, the problem I think that most people have when thinking about these things is that they think that genetic code is a mechanical operation rather than a probabilistic one, right? A deterministic rather than a probabilistic. And so the number of factors that end up calling on a particular segment of DNA and having it be incorporated in the cell, the permutation of the effect of that is quite high, especially during the growth period when you're in utero. So I think I think we would have a duty to cure things that were. What's a great one? I mean, the one my daughter works on, which is cystic fibrosis, right? I mean, they've basically got a therapy for that. Right? If you can fix those kind of things, hey, that makes sense to me, because we know that's a genetic defect, right? But when you start saying I'm going to improve things, I'm like, I don't want to know.
Here, also want to say the same applies to both. The way I understand, because genes, genetics and the gene, how it operates is essentially a probability machine. How do you know? How can you be sure that what you fix does not become a bigger problem later? In other words, is this problem even computationally reducible?
No, that's the problem. We can't. It's not.
Right.
It's not
So then
computational.
neither one is okay, right? Whether it's fixing problems versus augmentation. You could say, well, fixing problems is addressing a short-term harm, and so via negativa, we want to prevent that. We want to go fix that. But if you cannot be sure of the downstream effects generations later, then maybe you should restrict whether it's fixing problems or augmentation to just the one generation. Otherwise, meaning that if you do that, then this person should not have any offsprings.
Well, that's right. That's what I originally said. Is the only way you can be confident about this is if you don't allow reproduction, right? Because the reproduction is recombination. It's not.
Yeah, but my point is for both apply to the augmented individual as well as the fix the problem individual.
Well, okay, let me ask this question. If you do something, because you do something, I'm trying to think of something silly. Right? I mean, I'm stuck on the ears thing. I'm trying to make fun of Martin's reddish hair because I really
elf
like
ears and big tits.
Well,
as it go together.
all right, fine.
You can you can already do both with surgery. If you
That's not the same thing.
Also, I consider that false advertising if you don't fully inform the mate and have children.
I don't, having a diverse experience of women with and without, so to speak. The visual appeal with augmentation is quite nice, even if the practical appeal in the moment is not. I feel like it's an asshole right now. I got to be careful. What are we talking about? So I think we've covered the 3 points here, which is that it's probably a bad idea in general, unless we are very certain about these 3 SNPs, when they ever work together, they produce this catastrophic defect, and we would like to drop that from the gene pool in general, right? That's a simple thing we can test for, X number of cases and see, and it's reversible, and if we want, right? It's when you get into these, something like intelligence, which has over 1,000 that we know of, SNPs that seem to affect intelligence, right? That's fucking complicated. We have no idea what that would do.
But my question is, like the use of the 3 SMP example, right? Like, how can you be sure that generations later does not prevent, like, take for example the autism gene, or the autism genes or whatever. If hundreds of years ago, if people had the technology that we have now, they would probably think of this as a defect, not knowing that on the flip side, they'll also tend to create extreme geniuses on one end. This is one of those double-edged swords. And then if you only look at the detrimental side of it, especially if the long-term effects are hidden, the long-term beneficial effects are hidden, you're basically pruning that from the gene pool. What my point being is, given that this is a non-deterministic and probably computationally irreducible problem, genes, even the so-called bad ones, existed for a reason.
No,
they persisted throughout.
That's not true. That's not true.
They can exist because they weren't bad enough.
They weren't bad enough, right? It's like It's like homosexuality. Normally a child would abort, would miscarry, but it's not bad enough.
Okay.
Like let's go to autism specific, because I know some of the genes that are involved. So there are genes that, if are ineffective, have catastrophic consequences, right? And there are genes that there are multiple copies of, and so the variation is suppressed, right? In other words, the tweaking doesn't really matter. And there are variations that are decorative, like eye color and skin color, right? Hair color, right? But you have like what's this? SCN2A or SHANK3. I mean, if those things are absolutely associated with autism, and they're associated with the bad kind of autism. Whereas if you simply have a male brain, you will end up like us, the guys in this conversation, right? If you have a brain that is full-blown autism, that is a genetic defect. That is not an in utero development. The problem is that how many are there? Yeah, there's dozens we know already. The problem I know about is the histone problem. Anyway, so I don't know. I think there are definitely things we can cure. When we start, there are things that are purely decorative, and there are things that are systemic. And it's that third category of things that are very scary. You know, it might be that we need to splice something in there to achieve some miraculous end, but it's not true that genes survive. Matter of fact, the problem with the genome is so much of it is essentially dead, right? The human genome, so much of it's essentially dead. The thing is,
All of it is just inactivated.
yeah, I'm sorry. I was just about to explain. So that doesn't mean that if we weren't reproducing a circumstance in human history where that gene expression was necessary, it wasn't expressible, right? It wasn't able to come out. So to some degree, you can sort of backward evolve humans if you want, by backward evolving.
You mean like it's like a hidden cold past that wasn't exercised, that could not be reached for now.
I see it useful having that there as a backup should we need to go
Yes,
back for whatever reason.
that's right.
It's like that example. There had chickens with teeth
Yeah.
because all the code to produce teeth was there, just deactivated in normal chicken.
Yes.
And you switch on genes, and there you go.
Chickens are fucking mean. Do we want to really have chickens with teeth? That's scary.
That's called dinosaurs.
I didn't suggest it as
What
something.
about vaginas with teeth? Wait a minute, I don't want to go there.
Well, there's a vagina with teeth. There's a movie made about that.
I know.
Jesus.
Martin is right. It's great to fantasize about this stuff, but unless the degree of certainty is very high, I have sticking shit into the genome is not a good idea. All right.
My issue with this and actually many other things, that there's a general pattern that it's much easier to choose between yes or no. You can do that or you can't, but once you allow it, it's very hard to say go this far and no further.
Yes. Yes. It's what you're saying. It's a slippery slope.
Yes.
All right. We got that one done?
Yep. All right. Question 6. question prompted by this post by Curt. I'm gonna post it over
How do I
here.
open this?
Well, you just click on it. I just keep reading. In which he states that there is the classical explanation of quantum mechanics using fluid dynamics. Can you elaborate a little on this classical explanation? Also help midwits like me understand how the Institute can confidently make claims on physics despite seemingly having no physicists. Not trying to insult NLI MFN.
Yeah. I need a good analogy for this. This post is really good. I forgot I wrote that. When did I write that? Back in June? That's a good post.
June of last year.
Yeah, so a year and a half ago. Let me see how he phrased the question. And who asked this? We don't know who asked it.
Don't know.
I answer this in detail in the book on the logic. I'm saying something other than what you think I'm saying. I'm saying that what we're doing in quantum mechanics is using mathematical descriptions of probabilities. It's not a model. When Einstein did his models, he used pictures, and he did a lot of them. And I think that it's important to understand that he used a picture first, and once he had a model, he tried to develop the math of it. He didn't do it the other way around, try different bits of math without having a model for it. And so what's happened is partly because of the Copenhagen consensus around Niels Bohr, he said just calculate, which meant don't solve the problem of physics, maintain our success at calculating probabilities. And so we've had great success in quantum mechanics and calculating these probabilities. But these probabilities are determined by analysis of particles. They aren't determined by analysis of the quantum background from which waves, protoparticles, and particles evolve. So I originally went hunting for, because I was concerned about something in physics, I originally tried to catalog all the pseudoscientific theories in physics. There actually aren't that many. Because most of them are centered around this problem of mathiness, which I just described. But however, his name is escaping me now. We have that beautiful model of the quantum background. It's just one Planck length, I think. It's one Planck length cube of what's going on in the quantum background. And it's terrifying. Because you realize how small it is and how fast it's all happening. And so what's happening is they're trying to use a mathematical description of probabilities to determine causality without a model that starts with a quantum background that produces causality. One of the people who I thought was going to be a fruitcake, or a couple of people, not one, it's a group of people that I thought were going to be fruitcakes, turned out to have said, well, if you study the quantum background, it's actually built on these criteria. And that criteria is quite solid. And most recently, Neil Turok of Perimeter has come out and said, I think we're wrong. I think we've actually got it all figured out, and it's quite simple. So I'm waiting for him to publish, to which point I think it will confirm it. And it's, if you want to think, and the reason I say fluid dynamics is because it's something that humans can imagine. So when you, and it's, if you want to be able to create a model of something, you can imagine fluid dynamics. And most of us in work had some engineering background. You work in electronics, or radio waves or anything like that. You tend to use hydraulic metaphors to be able to understand what's going on, because that is the metaphor. And it's more important because the hydraulic metaphor appears to be the best metaphor, the best model for modeling everything in the universe. And not the only difference being that it's more like there's oil and water and some other stuff, right? There's things of different densities mixed together. So the basic idea that I tried to describe in the book on the logic is that if something's under pressure, there's a limited number of ways that it can release the pressure, and that includes the number of dimensions it can release it into. And that ends up being 3 and 4, or 3 plus 1. And that's because there's no way to store information in more than 3 dimensions that can be without going to a 4th dimension. Somewhat like the same problem with there's only, if you have a triangle, you can figure out everything as measurement. Well, it's more complex than that, is that if you have a triangle, there's no need for external information, except every point has to know its relation to 2 others. So you can describe anything, and from three points in 3 dimensions plus 1, you can describe pretty much anything, and it has to be that way. So great. So start with that. The second thing is that what do you do about the fact that what we call the conservation of energy is that there's nowhere for energy to go in the quantum universe. It can go down to the 0 point, which is the level of the quantum background. All right, it can go down to the 0 point of time. In other words, that's the slowest anything can be. And that is ridiculous once you look at the rate at which the quantum background operates, which is absurd. And so you look at those variables. You say, okay, how would I get from there to particle waves, protoparticles, and particles? And the way you get there with this constraint of 3 plus 1 dimensions is that you get there with spin. And so the same way you get a triangle to turn into 3 dimensions is with spinning it around other ways. So basically, the way to solve the problem is spin and anti-spin, or what we call positive and negative charges. And that is a way for the 2 charges to increase the amount of energy captured, right, while at the same time not breaking the law of conservation of energy. In other words, there's nowhere for the energy to go. So let's just start with that. You say, okay, now I've got polarity, and once you've got polarity and you got the pressure of the quantum background, you end up with all the different forces with the 2 major forces that explain the fundamental forces that we know in the 3 fundamental forces plus gravity. So I think we're actually there. And the reason I talk about this fluid dynamics is because I think they're just like economics got trapped in mathiness. I think that physics is trapped in mathiness. They're not trying to build a model and that's why all this crap comes out about multiple universes or whatever, instead of saying what's the simplest possible answer that is universally possible. And now what I just described is the simplest possible model. Now, is that enough to create a mathematical representation of it? No, but we can't find any exception to it. And if we go up through all the different formations of the particles, this would be possible with it. Are other things important, like what's Roger's spin thing called? Escaping me. But so we don't. Here's how I would look at it. Almost every mathematical description I can find looks like it's reducible to the pathway which current flows in this equilibrium that's attempted to be established by this accumulation of quanta of energy that has to stay in somewhat connection with the other to maintain a stable equilibrium that balances positive spin and negative spin, or what we think of as charge. And so I look at this and I'm like, well, that's a pretty simple answer, and I would need something that was just as simple to disagree with that. And I think the problem is that we've made this entire investment in the standard model of particles, and there's no model of those particles other than mathematical probability, and as such, there's no physics. There's no realism, naturalism, materialism there. So as such, when you look at this problem, I don't look at it like I'm a physicist. I look at it as, what are the lies being made here to do this? And what is constructible from first principles? And so I'm in the group that says, yeah, we've solved the problem. It's just a matter of people dying off and money being freed up for people to invest in modeling the quantum background and how it manifests as particles. And I think this is just one of those, the same problem we have in the bureaucracy in the United States government, because the post-war era is still surviving, and as Martin says, has been so diligent about this propaganda fucking era that was made up because of it, dying off. These things, Kuhn was right. Science advances with tombstones. We need a lot of tombstones in order for the physics to get corrected.
Well, assuming the people dying off did not already train the next generation into the linear paths that they're on.
You're going to need a fresh generation. And what's going to happen is somebody's going to come along, and there's going to be a consensus somewhere. Right now, I'm crossing that's out of perimeter in the next 10 years. Despite the fact that, what's his name is there, the fucking guy. What's his name? Anyway, Lee Smolin. Oh, guy. I mean, that guy, he must have had. There's something wrong with him. Anyway, the rest of the people at perimeter are quite good. So I expect this to come out in the next 10 years, and then there will be a disaster in the academy as they try to rearrange to make going back to doing physics as based on a model. Even Roger Penrose, I mean, his model of the expansionary universe, he does it with models. If you go to watch one of his lectures, he's got all these transparencies he still uses on the transparency projector. He does it with pictures because he has a mental model. And so whenever I hear people talking math, I'm like, yeah, and it's the same. It's the same issue I have with Weinstein, Eric Weinstein, is that he's right. There are 14 testable dimensions. We should be, but he's still working. He's still working from the math on down. I don't see a model, and it's not that I don't understand. I think I understand the one he talked about at Harvard, which is trying to solve this problem by disentangling two different systems of measurement. I think he's onto something there, but I don't think he's actually proposing a model. And I could be wrong. I could be wrong. But anyway, I think when you ask I think I've answered the question, which is the people who said the ether didn't exist were saying the kind of ether that we were thinking of at the time doesn't exist. The fact that the concept of an ether, in other words, a fluidic background to all of space, that appears to exist, and that's the quantum background, and it has a zero rate of energy and a zero rate of time, and from it, and it's constantly under stress. It's trying to express itself, and it only has two choices. That energy can be released by expansion into space, which it seems to be doing, and the energy can be released by spin, who condenses it into matter, and that's the two choices it has. I mean, I think it's pretty simple. Again, I go into all this in the book on the logic, so you can, when that comes out, you can see that. All right, that's it.
So we are at time. I guess we won't have time for question 7.
Oh, come on, let's do it.
What?
Oh, come on, we got to do it.
Okay. I guess it's the right timing, given what just recently happened. All right, question 7. Question for Martin. Do you consider whatifalthist right wing? My 2 cents, he is a 20-year-old boomer whose mental framework is paralyzed by his PTSD, something he routinely brings up on Twitter and his videos. So this question was asked several weeks ago before the recent events.
So without commenting on those, it's a spectrum and a multi-dimensional one at that. So if I want to be precise, right-wing compared to whom? Compared to modern normies or to our ruling classes? Of course. Compared to me, our team, and normies throughout most of history? Absolutely not. As you say, many aspects of his worldview are stuck in the boomer truth regime.
I can't. This guy's a friend of mine, right? And so I would say that his conservatism is tempered by his revenue, and that would be largely the way I would say it. Most people who get enough money from their opinions are somewhat subject to audience capture. And I think he's that's what you largely see.
No, I don't know if it's just me, but when I actually look at his audience and how it responds to him, it's far to the right of him.
Or maybe at least those are just the verbal ones.
They're definitely not stuck in the boomer truth regime.
I'll tell you what they know is his real concern. I think, and I'm getting this from his, because like we have Francis, right? Well, Rudyard has a guy too, right? So that guy would say that that while Rudyard is young, his average audience is actually relatively quiet, doesn't say too much, is relatively high income, the medium above is middle class or upper middle class income, is quite well educated, and is older. And so he is in this interesting space where it's really important to him to solve the crisis that his generation is going through. Yet the people who have invested invest in him, right, are actually older than that demographic. Does that make sense? They're more likely to be millennial. And so what we see in the comments from these guys is usually the younger generation that's more stressed and more right wing. We aren't seeing the people who actually cause money to flow. And I think that's what, and it's not like they have a lot of data and they're really good with that data. They understand that data very clearly. And so I think there's a couple of things going on there. What he says is that our people are more reactionary than his, and more right wing than his. That's what he says, and I would agree. So otherwise,
his actual paying audience, and I think you can tell by the type of sponsorship that he attracts.
Right, exactly.
Without judgment, you're saying he puts income before truth.
I would say that, like most people, there is a maximum amount of clarity, which you would call truth, that can be made, and if you give up, you overstep that boundary, you lose the opportunity to make the progress you do make. So I mean, it's a pragmatic choice. I mean, it is his living. This is he makes a living. It's a good living, and he pays his staff reasonably well to do this off of that. So would you risk your own living and the people that support you to address the JQ?
That option is not available to me anymore.
But we're different in that we don't talk to people in this very conventional normie prose, right?
I
We
think
base
very simply, what we do here on the YouTube and so on, we don't expect to get a penny for it,
yes,
and so we're not liable to be captured by the audience.
correct. So Martin. I just think it's funny that Martin is the most severe guy, and I feel like I'm the lefty in the group half the time. Martin makes me feel like I'm the lefty in the group.
You are.
All right. So I think, did we kill that one? Is that one good?
Mm-hmm. You know, I suggest we increase the frequency of these meetings in order to work through the backlog, but the backlog is still pretty damn long.
I know. What are you gonna do? I'm looking
We
through
are,
this one.
we are catching up.
I don't know about that. I mean, it's still in the double digits
So where are
That
we?
is true.
So that's
because as we put out more of these shows, as we double the frequency, I think people also up their frequency of asking questions.
Yes.
I'm just looking at whether the number is going up or down, and it's been going down this month.
Well, it's because we're doing more
Yes,
sessions. All right, are we done?
we are.
All right. This is Martin, Francis, and Curt for the National Law Institute. It's Saturday, December 28th. It's been our office hours section. We got through what, 6 questions?
Yes, 7.
Six
Actually.
questions. Did we get through? Oh, we got through 7 questions. Amazing. We're trying to break these up into individual shorts. Hopefully, we'll get that way. And thank you all for listening. Please leave. Go to the comments, click on the link, and add your questions so that we can get further behind. Bye all.
Bye.